This is The Search for Child Permanency, Analyzing House Bill 1262 by Michael Shetler. Defining the issue. So before we get started, we have to look at this bill and see what is the issue behind the creation of this bill. In other words, what were the policymakers trying to address when creating House Bill 1262? And as we analyze this bill, one thing specifically stood out to us as something that this bill is trying to address, and that is child permanency. You might be wondering, what is child permanency? Well, let's see here. Permanency is defined by the Child and Family Services Reviews process as a legally permanent, nurturing family for every child involved in the child welfare system. This is the ultimate goal for children who have been abused or neglected and are in out-of-home care. So again, the main issue behind House Bill 1262 is to achieve that child permanent situation. So again, finding that legally permanent, nurturing family for every child involved in the child welfare system. And we'll get into a little bit more how this bill tried to do that later on in the presentation. Permanency continued. There are three factors that influence child permanency. Let's look at them now. First is system level challenges. Second are different case level factors. And third are child and family level factors. All three of these factors work together to make up the differing factors that influence child permanency. Let's take a look at each of these individually to see what they really are. First, starting out with system level challenges. So what are system level challenges? These system level challenges are recruitment and retention of child care options for children in the system. So they're challenges having to do with recruitment and retention of child care options. This can include foster parents or parents interested in adopting, or even relatives who are interested in getting into the child welfare system. Second, different case level factors. This includes decreased placement stability, more frequent interactions with the child welfare system, and insufficient resources. All of these interact and can greatly affect child permanency and its rates. Lastly, child and family level factors. Age, gender, race, and level of physical and mental ability all impact child permanency. So is the issue of permanency relevant? If not, then this bill does not make sense for today's society. But if it does, then the bill definitely is impactful and definitely should be analyzed for future policymakers. And we'll do this by analyzing the statistics in society and see if this issue is really prevalent. In 2018, 125,000 children were awaiting permanency in the form of adoption, compared to only 63,000 confirmed adoptions. So this is almost a 2-to-1 ratio of children entering the child welfare system compared to those exiting in the form of adoption. So again, this is not a good statistic. We want that flipped, whereas we see more adoptions compared to the amount of children going into the system. So again, this shows the prevalency of this issue, that there are numerous amounts of children going into this child welfare system and not enough going into permanent homes, which is the goal of this policy and of child permanency in general. Second is the U.S. Children's Bureau states that just 5 short years ago, just under 430,000 children were in out-of-home care in the United States. That's almost 500,000 children not in permanent home situations. So that is an incredibly high number that we want to see severely lessened. Again, that's just an absurdly high number of children not in permanent homes, and that's something that this bill tries to address. And then lastly, the Children's Bureau states that between 2012 and 2018, there has been an additional 25,000 children awaiting for adoption and an additional 12,000 children entering foster care, as opposed to just 11,000 more adoptions. So this just kind of echoes kind of what that first stat was saying, as there's more children going into the system compared to those being adopted and getting put in permanent housing. So again, these stats just show that this is definitely an issue, and that child permanency is an issue that needs to be addressed by bills like House Bill 1262, and that future policies need to address this issue so that we see more children put in permanent housing, and so that they can live out their lives to the fullest with the most possible potential that they have. Historical background. So now we're going to kind of take a look at some of the historical policies and political action that have kind of laid the groundwork for bills like House Bill 1262 in addressing this issue of child permanency. And while there has been several that have done great things, there are kind of two things and two areas of policy that have really stuck out to me during my research. So we're going to address those now and see which of these policies affected this issue in the making of House Bill 1262 and addressing child permanency. And the first one that really jumped out to me was the 1974 Child Abuse and Prevention Act. And this act created the National Center for Child Abuse and Neglect, or the NCCAN, which established a model statute for child protective services that all 50 states have enacted, and 4 detrimental aspects to the child protective services were implemented through this, and those being a standard definition for child abuse and neglect, methods for reporting and investigating these acts, third, immunity for those who report these types of acts, and then fourth, prevention and public education efforts to help reduce the amount of child abuse and neglect we see in our country. And now, I don't know if you noticed, but earlier on in the slideshow, we talked about how abuse and neglect is one of the main areas that actually House Bill 1262 addresses, and then we also see it being addressed here in this act, in the Child Abuse and Prevention Act. And the reason that so many bills like these two are addressing this issue is because abuse and neglect is one of the biggest reasons behind children being put into the child welfare system. So many parent-child relationships are being destroyed by abuse and neglect. And so this issue affects child permanency, because if we can attack this issue and limit it and destroy it, hopefully, then we will start to see that ratio being flipped, as we talked about in the statistics a couple slides ago, where we will see more children being adopted in comparison to the amount of children being implemented into the system. So that's the overall goal here. And House Bill 1262 and the 1974 Child Abuse and Prevention Act really attempted to do great things for this area of study. Next, and more recently, was the 2008 Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act. And this act amended the Social Security Act to improve outcomes for children in foster care, connect and support relative caregivers, and offer incentives for adoption. So this kind of represents the other end of the child welfare process. And instead of what is impacting children going in, this impacts the amount of children going out. So we kind of address both areas of the process here with these two acts of legislation. And why this one is so impactful to me is that it really kind of emphasizes incentivizing adoption. And so if more acts like this continue to incentivize adoption, we will again see more parents becoming interested in becoming adoptive parents and taking more children out of the child welfare system. So if both of these acts can be fully appreciated and can inspire future legislation like this, we will again see more and more adoptive parents being created, and again taking more children out of the child welfare system, and again not allowing children to enter it, because again we are not allowing those bad situations to occur, such as abuse and neglect, or the reasons why we have children going into the welfare system. We're going to be ending those with future policies, which is the end goal. So again, both of these acts of legislation really jumped out to me because they address kind of both ends of the spectrum and of the process. And I think if bills can kind of look at these two, kind of see the impacts that they have and work off of them, we should hopefully see continued progress towards our end goal of increased child permanency. So how does House Bill 1262 specifically address this issue of child permanency? We're going to take a look at this by analyzing the goals of House Bill 1262 and seeing how the bill specifically addresses this issue of child permanency. So let's get started. First, the main goal of this bill is to achieve a higher rate of permanency for children who are in out-of-home care due to abuse and neglect. And again, we see how abuse and neglect is a specific target for this specific bill, and how, again, it's such a prevalent issue in this area of study, how abuse and neglect is responsible for a majority or a very high amount of children entering into the child welfare system. So again, this bill tries to address that specific issue, and again, that correlates with permanency for sure. And the way they try and do this is they try and make petitioning for biological parent-child termination more accessible to other caregivers in the child's life. And these individuals could include foster parents, relatives, de facto custodians, and guardians. So the way this bill tried to go about doing this was by making petitioning for termination of the biological parent-child relationship available to more individuals. As before this, the number of people that could petition for termination was very limited. And so by doing this, the bill makers hope to see more termination requests, thus ending more bad parent-child relationships, thus creating a more safe environment for these children. So again, they're trying to take children out of the bad relationship and out of the bad homes and into more permanent ones that are more healthy, where they can grow and thrive. So that's what this bill does, and specifically trying to target the petitioning of termination of the relationship between the biological child and parent. And then lastly, one of the main goals of the bill, they try and get more court assistants that would also make them responsible for keeping the Department of Child Services, the DCS, accountable for their role as a petitioner. So the DCS and other government agencies similar have been responsible for certain oversights where they haven't been able to process certain cases, which has been an issue for a while. And so what this bill does is they make the court more involved in making sure that the DCS and government agencies like it are more accountable for their role in this process. So that's really important, and we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more in future slides. So our policy analysis. Let's look at the positive takeaways from House Bill 1262. So some positive things we can take away from House Bill 1262 is the bill attempts to tackle the issue of permanency by focusing on terminating poor biological child-parent relationships. Again, we saw most of those due to neglect and abuse. Secondly, it attempts to address the issue of DCS and other government agencies intentionally not processing certain cases because of their lack of resources. So again, the DCS has been known to intentionally not process certain cases because they lack the resources, staff members, and that goes back to our earlier issues of the three factors that affect child permanency, and one was lack of resources and lack of staffing. And so DCS struggles from this, but this bill attempts to make them more responsible. But as we'll see later, that might not be enough for that specific issue. So where the bill failed and why the bill failed was first, again, here we go, is the lack of resources and funding, including staff, future foster parents, etc. But again, we can't blame the DCS for everything if they don't have the resources they need. Like, they can do as much as they can with the resources they have, but if they don't have the resources necessary, they're not going to be able to do their job to the fullest extent that they can. And so this bill didn't really address the resource issue and funding. And again, for future foster parents, they didn't really include any kind of resources or benefits for that kind of thing, which would be something that they should look into for future policies. And then again, a lack of overseers for the implementation of the policy. So it kind of talks about the courts being in charge and looking over kind of the DCS, but it doesn't really talk about anyone overseeing the bill implementation itself. So we don't really have any kind of overseer or like program leader to kind of see this policy effectively used. And then also we see a lack of ability to measure effectiveness. There's no real way to measure effectiveness. You can kind of maybe see the adoption rates and people going to be more permanent, the children being adopted and put in these permanent situations. But again, there are a lot of different factors that go into this. It doesn't necessarily have to be from this specific bill and what it specifically did. So finding a way to be able to measure the effectiveness of this specific bill will help future policymakers know what to focus on for future bills and see what's effective and what's not. Finally, let's look at some of the takeaways for future policies. There were some good things from House Bill 1262, as well as some things that needed to be improved upon. So now we're going to look at some of the key takeaways that we need to see for future implementation so that we see successful bills being put forth to successfully impact child permanency. So again, what issues need to be addressed to ensure future policy success? First is a plan for increased funding and resource provision. And if we go back to the three main factors that impacted child permanency, those being case level factors, system level factors, and child and family level factors, this would help to address the case level factors, and that being a majority and most impactful of those being the resource issue, where a plan needs to be addressed so that they can increase funding and resource provision. And in my opinion, this is one of the biggest lacking aspects of the bill. There was not really a plan for funding and resource provision, including staffing as well. And in my opinion, for any bill, really, funding is going to be one of the most impactful and important issues. And because it wasn't really addressed, it's going to make it harder to be successfully implemented. And specifically, more needs to be done about the staffing and funding for agencies like the DCS, because again, they were faulted for a lot of things and a lot of oversights involving child permanency and the adoption processes and different cases that they overlooked. But again, a company is only as good as the amount of resources and staffing that they have. And without the proper amount of staffing and resources, they're not going to be as effective as they can possibly be. So more needs to be done for them. Plans need to be put in place to increase the amount of funding for that area specifically. And then more needs to be done to accommodate the parent and or parents who are altering their own lives to invest in children in need. A foster parent was actually quoted as saying, "As a foster parent, you spend every day with the child in your care, yet all major decisions in their life are out of your control. Anything from medical needs, haircut styles, whether they go on vacation, scheduled visits with birth family, and much more is put into place by the case manager." So the impact of the parents in this process cannot be overstated. They, in my opinion, are one of the most important factors of this process. And this quote just kind of shows how they're really not allowed to do a lot of things. And while that's put in place for specific reasons, I feel like more needs to be done to accommodate that issue and to give them more responsibility. Because again, they're fostering these children and a lot of times adopting these children. And so they need to be able to really be put in the shoes of a possible parent for long-term goals. So again, this will kind of tackle some of the system level factors as discussed earlier. Those include the people who are interested in adopting and fostering. So more needs to be done to accommodate them through incentives, through other areas where they are heard and felt that they are heard in their issues in their fostering. And this can also tackle some of the child and family level factors. If we focus more on the parents and their impact in this area and we get them more involved, that'll mean more parents in the fostering and adoption game, and then hopefully that'll impact the child and family level factors such as the individuals, children in the welfare system and their diversity. And so more parents and more fostering and adopting parents will mean a more diverse range of adopting people, because again, there'll be more adopting people or adopters. Thus, more children of all kinds will be adopted. So that's one of the biggest goals here that we need to see, in my opinion, for future policy implementation, is to address the system level factors in the parents who are going to be possible adopters. Next is implement a program that oversees termination, petitioning, and effectiveness. So what really needs to be done is there needs to be a program that oversees the effectiveness of the termination petitioning plan. Again, a lot goes into child permanency, and so it's hard without having a specific program to measure effectiveness to see how effective this idea of increased accessibility to termination as being a key factor in more adoption and positive progressions in this child permanency issue. So we need to have a program that oversees kind of how effective this specific plan is. And then there also needs to be programs set aside to monitor the DCS. And again, they need to be held responsible for those oversights that we kind of talked about earlier. Hopefully they can get those increased resources and funding. But again, there needs to be a program that oversees this issue. And as it kind of was addressed in House Bill 1262 with the courts, I think more needs to be done to kind of make sure that those agencies are doing what they need to do, because they play a really important role in this process. And then lastly, they should include termination adjustments implemented in House Bill 1262. So I really liked the termination idea and the increased accessibility for termination, because again, I see that would result in more children getting out of bad situations with their biological family. And so I feel like in future policies, this is a really good idea from House Bill 1262 that should be implemented in future policies to make termination more accessible to more caring adults who are involved in the children's lives.